Rose Whitaker did not knock. She pushed open the door to Broken Creek Ranch with both hands, her worn traveling bags hitting the frame with a sound like a judge's gavel, and she looked Nathaniel Carter dead in the eye before he could open his mouth to stop her. "I heard you need a cook," she said. "I'm the best one you'll ever turn away." Nathaniel stared at her, at the full, heavy weight of her standing in his doorway, at the flour dust still caught in her dark hair from the last kitchen she'd worked, at the steady, unflinching way she held his gaze, and then he did something that cut deeper than any insult she had ever been handed in 25 years of living. He laughed. "Before we go any further into Rose's story, if this is the kind of tale that speaks to your heart, stories about women who refuse to stay small, even when the whole world tries to make them invisible, please take just a moment and subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a single story we bring you. And when you leave a comment, tell us what city or town you're watching from. Every single name means the world to us. It tells us how far Rose's story has already traveled, and it reminds us why we keep telling these tales. Now let us go back to that doorway in Montana, 1883, and watch what happens when the wrong man laughs at the wrong woman. The laugh was short. It came out of Nathaniel Carter the way a reflex comes out of a man, automatic, without thinking, and impossible to take back the moment it left his body. He wasn't a cruel man by nature. People who knew him would have said he was fair, even decent, most of the time. But he was a man of his era, which meant he had learned without anyone teaching him directly, that certain things in this world had their proper size and shape. And a woman standing in front of him asking to cook for 27 working cowboys did not fit any image he had ever been given. So he laughed, and Rose Whitaker stood there and let him finish. She had learned a long time ago that the best response to a man's laughter was patience. Patience and the particular kind of stillness that said louder than any words could, that she had heard worse and survived worse, and would continue to stand exactly where she was standing for as long as it took. When Nathaniel finally stopped, when the last edge of that laugh had died out in the open air between them, Rose shifted one of her bags to her other hand and said very quietly, "You done?" Nathaniel blinked. He hadn't expected that. Most people flinched when Nathaniel Carter looked at them with disapproval. He was not a small man. He had built Broken Creek Ranch from nothing over 15 years of grueling work, and the authority of that effort lived in his face and in the set of his shoulders. He was accustomed to people adjusting themselves to accommodate him. Rose Whitaker did not adjust herself for anyone. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I asked if you were done," she said, "because I've got a proposition for you, and I'd like to make it before either one of us wastes any more of the afternoon." Nathaniel crossed his arms. Behind him, through the open door to the main hall, two of his cowboys had stopped walking to listen. One of them, a young hand named Dusty, had already started grinning. "Ma'am," Nathaniel said, and he put a particular weight on the word that was meant to communicate the distance between her place and his. "I think you've got the wrong ranch. We need someone who can handle this kitchen. 27 men, 3 meals a day, and a workload that'd break most cooks I've seen." "I know," Rose said. "I read the notice." "Then you know this isn't a boarding house job. This isn't Sunday supper for a family of 5. "No," she agreed. "It's harder than that, which is why you've had 3 cooks walk out on you in the last 4 months. Nathaniel went very still. "How do you know that?" he asked. "People talk," Rose said simply. "Towns talk. I've been through Harlow Creek and Millsfield and Copper Bend in the last 6 weeks looking for work, and every place I stopped, somebody had something to say about Broken Creek Ranch and its kitchen problem." She tilted her head just slightly. "Also, the fact that you haven't told me to leave yet tells me you're a lot more desperate than you want to let on." Behind Nathaniel, Dusty's grin widened into something that nearly cracked his face open. Nathaniel heard it. He turned just enough to give Dusty a look that sent the young man retreating around the corner. Then he turned back to Rose. "I appreciate your confidence," he said in a tone that said he appreciated no such thing. "But I need to be straight with you, since you seem to value straightness. What I'm looking for isn't." He paused. He was, to his credit, searching for words that weren't cruel. He wasn't finding them fast enough. Rose found them for him. "A woman who looks like me," she said. "No bitterness in it. No performance. Just the flat, plain fact of the thing, offered up cleanly the way you'd hand someone a tool they needed." Nathaniel had the decency to look uncomfortable. "That's not what I—" "It is," she said, still without heat. "And that's fine. You wouldn't be the first man to think it, and you won't be the last. But here's what I'm going to offer you, Mr. Carter, because I'm running low on options and I suspect you are too." She set one of her bags down on the porch with a deliberate, solid sound. "Give me one meal. Tonight. Whatever's in your kitchen right now, however bad the situation is in there, let me cook dinner for your men. If they leave that table hungry or unhappy, I'll walk off this property without a single argument and you'll never have to think about me again. But if they really eat, then you give me the job and you stay out of my kitchen, unless I ask you in." The afternoon light was sitting heavy on the ranch yard. Somewhere past the fence line, she could hear cattle moving and the distant sound of men calling to one another in the way working men do, easy and rough and carrying across the open land. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the kitchen. He thought about the state of it the last cook, a man named Preston, had left in the middle of the night 3 weeks ago without so much as a note, and nobody had been able to produce a decent meal since. He thought about his cowboys, who were eating salt jerky and cold biscuits that tasted like disappointment. He thought about Caleb Morgan, his foreman, who had told him that morning, with a jaw tight as a fist, that if the food situation didn't improve, they were going to start losing hands to the hindrance spread down the valley. He thought about all of that, and then he stepped aside and gestured at the door. "Kitchen's in the back," he said. "Through the hall left at the end." Rose picked up her bag. "Thank you," she said, and walked past him into the house. She heard him say, under his breath, "To nobody in particular, Lord. I hope I don't regret this." She didn't say anything back, but she thought, "You won't." The kitchen was worse than she'd expected, and she had expected bad. It wasn't a matter of the room itself being small or poorly built. The room was actually generous, wide enough to work in, with a good stone hearth and a proper iron range and shelving that ran floor to ceiling on the east wall. Whoever had designed this kitchen had understood what a working ranch needed. The bones were solid, but the bones were buried under weeks of neglect, and neglect in a kitchen has a particular smell that hits you before you even step fully through the door. It's the smell of things left too long, grease gone rancid, flour that had drawn moisture and started to turn, the ghost of meals that hadn't quite worked sitting in the air like a bad memory. Rose stood in the doorway for exactly 10 seconds, breathing it in, cataloging it. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to work. She found the stove first. It was clogged ash and old grease had built up in the firebox, and the flue was drawing poorly, which explained why the last cook's food had been inconsistent. You could have the best ingredients in Montana territory, and if your fire wasn't running clean, your food would taste like effort and frustration. She cleaned the firebox. She opened the flue and cleared it. She got a proper fire going and stood back and listened to the draw improve, and felt the particular satisfaction of a machine beginning to work the way it was meant to. Then she went to the shelves. The pantry situation was a story told in shortages and waste. There was flour, a lot of it, which was something. There were dried beans that hadn't been properly stored and had gone partially weevily in the bottom third of the sack. There were onions that had started to go soft. There were tins of tomatoes and a crock of lard and a string of dried peppers hanging near the window that had been there long enough to fade to a dusty brownish red. And then, in the corner, covered by a cloth that someone had thrown over it carelessly, she found the beef. It was a hindquarter, recent enough to still be good, and it was better than anything else in the room. Someone had procured it, and then apparently had no idea what to do with it. Rose put her hand on it and thought. She said that sometimes just stood with her hand on an ingredient and thought, not in words exactly, but in a kind of conversation with the food itself. "What do you want to be? What do you need from me?" She'd been doing it since she was 8 years old, standing in her mother's kitchen in a farmhouse in Ohio, watching her mother cook for boarders who came through twice a week and needed to leave the table, feeling like someone had cared for them. That was what her mother had always said cooking was really about. Not ingredients, not technique, care. You could taste the difference, her mother told her, between food that was made in a hurry by someone who wanted to be done with it, and food that was made by someone who was paying attention to the people who were going to eat it. Rose had never forgotten that. She built her meal from the inside out, starting with what the beef needed, which was time and low heat, and the right company of flavors, and then building around it with the vegetables she salvaged from the soft onions, cutting away what had gone bad, keeping what was still good, because waste was its own kind of failure. And the root vegetables she found in a crate half hidden under the bottom shelf, and the dried herbs in their little paper packets that she opened one by one and smelled until she found the ones that still had their strength. She set the stew to simmer. She got the bread started. The bread was the thing that would tell them the most. A man could eat a meal and tell himself it was acceptable. But fresh bread that came out of the oven when the room was already warm, with the smell of everything cooking, fresh bread reached something underneath the thinking part of a person. Something animal and old and deeply fundamentally comforted. Rose knew this the way she knew how to breathe. While the bread was rising, she scrubbed down the work surfaces. She reorganized the shelves in the order that made sense for actual cooking, things you reached for every day at eye level, heavier items lower, things you needed rarely up top. She found a broom and swept. She found a bucket and water and mopped. The kitchen, by the time the bread went into the oven, was unrecognizable. She was not aware of being watched. She didn't notice until she heard the sound of boots stopping outside the door that the foreman, Caleb Morgan, had been standing in the hall for some portion of the last hour, not saying anything, just watching. When she finally turned and saw him there, she didn't startle. She just looked at him. Caleb Morgan was a lean man in his early 40s, with a weathered face and eyes that were the color of creek water in early spring gray-green, and a little cold, the kind of eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by most things. He was studying her, the way you study something you aren't sure about yet. Not hostile exactly, but not welcoming. "Something I can help you with?" Rose asked. "Just checking," he said. "On me or on your dinner?" Something flickered in those gray-green eyes. Not quite a smile. "Almost. Both, I suppose. Dinner'll be ready when it's ready," she said. "And I don't need checking on." Caleb didn't move. He leaned one shoulder against the door frame and crossed his arms in a way that was so similar to how Nathaniel had stood on the porch that Rose wondered if it was something all ranchmen learned. Or if these two particular men had simply been around each other long enough to pick up the same habits. "You know what the last cook's problem was?" Caleb said. "I can guess," she said, turning back to the stove to check the stew. He was cooking for himself, making what he knew how to make without thinking about who was eating it. A pause. "How'd you know that?" Caleb asked. "I looked at the pantry." He kept good stores of spices for complicated food. But the basics, the things that fuel working men, those were running low and poorly managed. He was interested in being a cook. He wasn't interested in feeding people. She tasted the stew, reached for the salt, added it with careful pinches. "There's a difference." Another pause, longer this time. "Nathaniel thinks you'll be gone by morning," Caleb said. "What do you think?" Caleb pushed himself off the door frame. He stood there for a moment, looking at the kitchen, at the clean surfaces, and the reorganized shelves, and the steam coming off the pot, and the bread smell that was beginning to fill the entire room. "I think," he said slowly, "that the kitchen smells better than it has in 6 months. Then he walked away. Rose turned back to her stove and she was almost smiling. The Cowboys came in at 6 o'clock the way a tide comes in, all at once, inevitable and loud. 27 of them, pushing through the door of the dining hall with the energy of men who have spent 10 hours in hard physical labor and are ready to be done with the day, and fed and left in peace. They smelled of horses and dirt and honest work. They were loud with the kind of automatic loudness that men in groups develop not from any individual need to be heard, but from the cumulative noise of all of them existing together in the same space. They stopped talking when they smelled the food. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way awareness spreads through a group, one man catching it first, his head coming up, and then the man next to him noticing the shift and lifting his own head, and then the next, until the whole tide of them had gone quiet, and still in a way that 27 working cowboys almost never went quiet and still. The bread was on the tables. She'd sliced it thick and set it in baskets and put the butter alongside it. Proper soft butter she'd found in the cold cellar, where Preston apparently hadn't thought to look. And the smell of it cut through everything else in the room, like a sound cuts through noise. Then she came through the door from the kitchen, with the first pot of stew. She was aware of the looks. She had learned to be aware of looks without letting them land the way they were intended to. The comments she heard, and she heard them, because men in groups forget that a woman's hearing is excellent, were the comments she had heard her entire life. She filed them away in the same place she filed all such comments, in a part of herself that was very quiet and very small and very sealed shut, and she kept walking. She set the pot on the table. She said, "Dinner's ready. Bowls are stacked. Help yourselves." And she went back to the kitchen. She stood in the kitchen and she waited. The silence in the dining hall lasted longer than she'd expected. Then she heard the sound of a ladle against the side of a pot. Then a bowl, then the first spoon, then nothing for almost 15 seconds. Then a sound she knew, a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a sigh, but something in between, something that comes out of a person involuntarily when they have put something in their mouth that is better than they were braced for. A sound of relief, of unexpected pleasure. Then another one. Then another. Then the entire dining hall erupted in the ordinary noise of men eating, the scraping of bowls, the tearing of bread, the low rumble of conversation starting back up, but it was a different quality of noise now. Warmer, more settled. Rose leaned against the kitchen counter and let herself breathe. After a few minutes, Dusty came to the kitchen door. He was holding an empty bowl and looking at her with an expression she had not seen on a man's face in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. It was gratitude, uncomplicated, direct, genuine gratitude. "Ma'am," he said, "is there more?" "There's plenty," she said. He beamed at her. He looked about 19 years old when he did it. "This is the best thing I've eaten since I left Missouri," he said. "I mean that truly. Thank you," she said. "Go eat." He went. She heard him say something to someone as he walked back to the table. She couldn't catch all of it, but she heard the word incredible, and she heard a sound of general agreement. When she finally carried the empty pots back to the kitchen and looked through the serving window at the tables, she saw something she had not seen in the descriptions of Broken Creek Ranch that had reached her through all those other towns. She saw 27 men who looked, for the first time in a long time, like they were exactly where they wanted to be. Nathaniel found her in the kitchen near 8 o'clock, after the men had cleared out, and she had begun the long work of cleanup. He stood in the doorway. He didn't speak for a moment. Rose kept washing the pot she was washing, her back to him, and waited. "Well," he said finally. "Well," she agreed. "I didn't hear any complaints." "No," she said, "you didn't." Another pause. He was, she could tell from his voice, a man struggling with something. Not a bad struggle. The kind of struggle that happens when you know you need to say something, and the saying of it is going to require you to be platesly smaller than you were before you opened your mouth. "I may have been hasty," he said on the porch this afternoon. Rose set the pot down on the drying rack and turned to face him, drying her hands on her apron. "May have been," she said, and she kept her voice mild, because she wasn't trying to punish him. She was just being accurate. Nathaniel had the look of a man who is being held accountable and knows it is fair. He said with some effort, "I was hasty." "All right," she said. He waited for more. When there was no more, he said, "The job is yours. If you still want it." "I want it," she said, "starting tomorrow." "Starting tonight," she said. "There are things in your pantry that need to be addressed before morning, or they'll be worse by tomorrow afternoon." And your flour stores need to be rotated and properly sealed, or you'll lose half of them to moisture by the end of the week. She looked at him steadily. I'd like to start tonight. Nathaniel blinked. It's already after 8. I know what time it is, she said pleasantly. He looked at her for a moment, this woman who had arrived with nothing but worn bags and a proposition, who had walked into his wrecked kitchen and in the space of an afternoon had turned it into something that made his Cowboys look like themselves again, and he made a decision that he would later understand was one of the most important decisions he'd made in 15 years of running a ranch. He stepped out of the doorway. Kitchen's yours, he said. And Rose turned back to work. She did not smile until he was gone. But when she smiled, it was the smile of a woman who knows exactly how far she has come and exactly how far she intends to go. There were things she had not told Nathaniel Carter yet. Things she had noticed during those hours in his pantry numbers that didn't add up, shortages that made no sense given the purchase orders. Tacked to the shelf wall. A pattern in the waist that looked less like carelessness and more like something deliberate. She had been working in kitchens long enough to know that the story of a ranch's kitchen was never just about food. It was about everything that flowed through a place, the money and the trust and the care and the attention. And something at Broken Creek Ranch had been draining away. She didn't know yet what it was. She didn't know yet who was responsible. But Rose Whitaker had been solving problems that no one else noticed for her entire life. She picked up her inventory notebook, a small leather-covered thing she'd kept in the bottom of her traveling bag through every kitchen she'd ever worked, and she opened it to a fresh page. She began to write. Outside, the Montana night was settling over the ranch like a held breath, and somewhere past the fence line a coyote called once, and then went quiet. And the fire in the stove that Rose had rebuilt from scratch that afternoon burned clean and steady and true. She wrote in that notebook until nearly midnight. The scratching of her pencil was the only sound in the kitchen, steady and deliberate, the way Rose did most things. She wrote down every number she had found on the purchase orders, tacked to the shelf wall. She wrote down the quantities that were missing. She wrote down the dates because dates told stories if you let them, and the dates on these orders were telling her something she didn't fully understand yet, but couldn't ignore. Then she closed the notebook, tucked it into her apron pocket, and went to bed in the small room off the back of the kitchen that had been the cook's quarters, a narrow room with a single window and a cot that had seen better decades. But it was hers now, and she had slept in worse. She lay there in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch settle around her. She thought about the numbers. She thought about the pattern. And then, because she was a practical woman who understood that a tired mind makes mistakes, she closed her eyes and let herself sleep. Morning at Broken Creek Ranch came before the sun did. Rose was already at the stove when the first gray light started at the edges of the window, and the fire was built, and the coffee was on, and the biscuit dough was resting under a cloth by the time she heard the first boots on the porch outside. She had been up since 4. She preferred it that way. The hour before a ranch woke up was the best hour for thinking, and Rose had a great deal to think about. The first man through the door was Dusty, because Dusty was apparently always the first man through any door where food was involved. He came in with his hat already in his hand, blinking against the lamplight, and when he saw her standing at the stove, he stopped and looked genuinely surprised, as if some part of him had decided overnight that yesterday had been a dream. "You're still here," he said. "Where else would I be?" Rose said. "I don't know," he admitted. "A lot of folks don't stay past the first night." "I'm not a lot of folks," she said. "Sit down, coffee's ready." He sat down at the long kitchen table, the cook's table, set apart from the dining hall, proper, and wrapped both hands around the mug she set in front of him with the reverence of a man receiving something sacred. He drank, he closed his eyes, he said, "Lord have mercy." "Good?" Rose asked, without turning from the stove. "Ma'am," Dusty said, "I don't know what you put in this coffee, but I have had coffee from Kansas City to Billings, and this is the finest cup I have ever held in my hands." "I didn't put anything special in it," she said. "I just cleaned the pot." A beat of silence. The pot does it. The pot, Rose said pleasantly, had about 4 months of old grounds baked into the bottom of it. What you've been drinking every morning tasted like old coffee, because it was old coffee. Every new pot was being made on top of the residue of the last dozen pots. Dusty stared at his mug. Lord, he said again, this time with feeling. The other men came in over the next 20 minutes in ones and twos, each of them registering surprise some more subtle than others that Rose was there, at the stove, already working. A few of them said good morning, with the careful courtesy of who had been raised to be polite to women, even when they weren't sure what to make of them. A few of them said nothing and just sat down. One man, a broad-shouldered hand named Tuck, who had been one of the louder voices the night before when she first arrived, came in, looked at her back, and sat at the far end of the table without a word. Rose was aware of all of it. She said nothing, she cooked. The biscuits came out of the oven golden and even, and she put them on the tables with a crock of honey and the good butter from the cold cellar. And she put out the eggs she'd scrambled, with a particular combination of patience and heat that made them soft and rich instead of rubbery. And the thick-cut bacon she'd found at the back of the cold cellar behind a crate of dried apples, still perfectly good, just overlooked. The dining hall went quiet in that same way it had gone quiet the night before, that wave of stillness that moved through a group of men when something interrupted what they were expecting. What they had been expecting, she understood, was bad food. They had been braced for it. They had arrived at that table armored against disappointment, the way people do when they have been disappointed enough times in the same place, and that armor was a thing she could feel in the room like a weather system. She watched it dissolve. She watched it dissolve biscuit by biscuit, bite by bite, cup by cup, until the dining hall was filled with the loose and ordinary sounds of men who were being taken care of and knew it and had let themselves accept it. Tuck at the far end of the table did not look up from his plate. But he reached for a second biscuit. Rose noticed. She noticed everything. Caleb Morgan came to find her at mid-morning, when the men were out on the range, and the kitchen was quiet, and she was deep in what she had already privately designated as the inventory problem. She had the purchase orders spread out on the kitchen table, arranged by date, and she was cross-referencing them against the physical contents of the pantry with the methodical focus of a woman who has been told her whole life that she isn't smart enough to figure things out and has. Consequently, developed the habit of figuring out everything. Caleb stopped in the doorway. "What is all that?" he asked. "Records," she said without looking up. "From where?" "Your shelves." She tapped the stack with one finger. They were tacked up behind the flour bins. 3 months of purchase orders. Caleb came into the kitchen slowly, the way a man enters a room where he senses something significant is happening and isn't sure yet whether it concerns him. He stood at the edge of the table and looked at the papers. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "I'm looking for where the food went," she said. He frowned. "What do you mean, where it went?" "It got cooked and eaten." "Some of it did," Rose said. She turned one of the purchase orders around so it faced him and put her finger on a line near the bottom. "This is a delivery from 6 weeks ago. 200 pounds of beef, 40 pounds of dried beans, a full case of tinned tomatoes, 20 pounds of coffee," and she moved her finger to the next line, 60 pounds of flour. Caleb looked at it. "All right. How many men do you run on this ranch?" she asked. 27, same as now, and before the last cook left, the one before that. Preston took over from another fellow named Amos. Amos left in March. So for the last you've had the same number of men, eating the same 3 meals a day. She picked up a second purchase order. "This is the delivery from 4 weeks ago. Look at the quantities." Caleb looked, his frown deepened. "That's less than half," he said. "Yes," Rose said. "So they ordered less, but the order before that was the same as the first one I showed you." The quantities dropped in the last 2 deliveries. Not gradually, suddenly. In the space about 3 weeks, the orders dropped by more than half, and the number of men on ranch didn't change. She looked at him steadily. But the money being paid to the supplier didn't drop. "I found the payment records. The same amount was going out from the ranch accounts, but half the food was coming in. The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb straightened up. He wasn't looking at the papers anymore. He was looking at Rose. His gray-green eyes had sharpened in a way that made her understand this was a man who was quick when the situation demanded it, even if he moved slowly by habit. "That's a serious thing you're suggesting," he said. "I'm not suggesting anything," Rose said. "I'm showing you numbers. The numbers are suggesting things all on their own. You think someone's been skimming the supply orders. I think," Rose said carefully, "that money has been leaving this ranch in the wrong direction. I think your men have been eating poor food and having a hard time of it, not because there wasn't enough money in the accounts to feed them properly, but because the money designated for food wasn't entirely being spent on food." Caleb was silent for a long moment. "Who handles the supply orders?" he asked, and his voice had gone very level, the kind of level that comes from effort. "That's what I was about to ask you," Rose said. Another pause. "Walter Grayson," Caleb said. "He's the ranch supply manager. Has been for 2 years. I don't know Mr. Grayson," Rose said. "I'm not saying anything about him as a person. I am saying that whoever signs these orders and handles the accounts needs to have a conversation with Nathaniel Carter, and that conversation needs to include these papers." Caleb picked up one of the purchase orders. He held it and looked at it for a long time, turning it slightly in his hands, the way a man handles something that has become suddenly heavier than it looks. "Does Nathaniel know you're looking at this?" he asked. "Not yet," Rose said. "I wanted to be certain of what I was seeing before I brought it to him." "I don't make accusations without evidence." Caleb set the order back down carefully. "How certain are you?" he asked. "Certain enough to show him," she said. "Not certain enough to say more than what the numbers say." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, with an attention he hadn't given her before, the kind that had nothing to do with her size or her appearance or any of the assumptions he'd carried through the door when he'd first seen her on that porch. He was looking at the way her mind worked, which was visible if you were paying close enough attention, like a current you could see moving beneath the surface of still water. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've run kitchens before," she said. "A kitchen is a small economy. Money comes in, food comes in, meals go out. When the numbers don't balance, there's a reason. Finding the reason is part of the job. Most cooks don't think of it that way." "Most cooks," Rose said, "haven't had to fight to keep their jobs since they were 17 years old. When you have to justify your presence everywhere you go, you learn to pay attention to things other people overlook." She said it without self-pity, the way she said most things directly, as a fact, without asking for a response. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll take you to Nathaniel this afternoon. After the men come in from the south pasture." "All right," Rose said. "In the meantime," Caleb said, with a slight shift in his tone that was as close as she'd yet seen him come to something wry, "what's for lunch?" Rose almost smiled. "Beans and cornbread," she said. "With what I suspect will be the first properly seasoned pot of beans this ranch has had since sometime last year." Something in Caleb's face shifted. It was subtle, and she almost missed it, but she had been reading people her whole life the way other people read words on a page. And what she saw in his face in that moment was not quite guilt and not quite shame, but something in the neighborhood of both, the expression of a man who has begun to understand that he misjudged something significantly and is reckoning with the size of the mistake. He didn't say anything else. He nodded once and walked out. Rose turned back to her papers. Lunch went the way breakfast had gone, which was to say it went better than anyone expected and produced in the dining hall that same quality of settled warmth that Rose was already beginning to think of as the real product of her work, not the food itself, but the feeling the food created, the loosening of tension, the return of something human in men who had been ground down by too many bad meals and too much uncertainty. It was during lunch that Tuck spoke to her for the first time. She was carrying a pot of beans back to the kitchen when he appeared in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen corridor, and she almost walked into him because she hadn't expected anyone to be there. She stopped. He was a big man, not just broad through the shoulders, but tall with it, the kind of physical presence that tended to be used as punctuation in most conversations. He had a face that didn't give much away, blunt-featured and weathered, with eyes that were so dark they were almost black. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, and Rose waited, because she'd learned that some people needed the space of silence to get to what they actually meant to say. "The beans were good," Tuck said finally. "Thank you," Rose said. Another pause. "I said some things yesterday," he said, "when you arrived." "You probably heard." "Sound travels," Rose agreed. Something moved through his expression, not quite discomfort. Something older than that, something that had been sitting with him and was ready to be put down. "I was out of line," he said. Rose shifted the pot to her other arm. "Yes," she said, "you were." He blinked. He had probably expected more gracious forgiveness, or at least the performance of it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," Rose said, "and I appreciate that." "I do." She looked at him steadily. "Now, if you want to make it right, the best way you can do that is by being the kind of man in this dining hall who doesn't let other men talk that way about anyone who walks through that door." Tuck blinked again. "You're big," Rose said simply. "People listen to you whether you ask them to or not. That's influence. What you do with it is your business." "But you asked, so I told you." She walked past him with her pot. She heard him stand there for a moment, and then she heard him walk back into the dining hall, and she heard, though she couldn't see it, the shift in his posture as he settled back into his seat. And something about the quality of the noise in the hall changed slightly, the way a room changes when the largest person in it has decided something. She went back to her stove and didn't think about it further. She thought about the numbers. The meeting with Nathaniel did not go the way Caleb had said it would. It went sideways, and it went sideways fast, because Walter Grayson was sitting in Nathaniel's office when Caleb knocked on the door at 4 o'clock, and the moment Rose walked in behind Caleb carrying her organized sheaf of purchase orders, something happened in Walter Grayson's face that told her everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. Walter Grayson was a spare, neat man of about 50 with a carefully maintained appearance that spoke for someone who considered his presentation important. He had thin hands and a quality of stillness that Rose had encountered before in people who spent a lot of time managing information, a kind of controlled watchfulness, the stillness of a man who was always calculating. When he saw the papers in her hands, that stillness cracked. It was brief, a fraction of a second. A flash of something behind his eyes that was gone almost before it registered. But Rose had seen it. She filed it away. Nathaniel looked up from his desk at the three of them with the expression of a man who had been in the middle of something and was making the quick calculation of whether this interruption was worth his time. "Caleb," he said, and then with a slight shift, "Miss Whitaker." "Sorry to interrupt," Caleb said, "but Rose has found something in the kitchen records that I think you need to see today." Nathaniel's eyes moved to the papers. "What kind of something?" he said. "May I?" Rose asked, and she moved to the desk before he'd fully answered, because she had learned that waiting for full permission sometimes meant never getting it. She laid the purchase orders out in the order she'd arranged them, 3 months of deliveries in a row, and she placed beside them the payment records she'd found in the kitchen account book, and she did not look at Walter Grayson's while she did this, though she was entirely aware of exactly where he was in the room and exactly how still he had become. "This is 6 weeks of supply orders," she said to Nathaniel. "These are the quantities delivered. These are the quantities paid for." She put her finger on the divergence point. "The payments are consistent. The deliveries dropped by more than half, starting 3 weeks before the last cook left." Nathaniel leaned over his desk. He was quiet looking. "These are just the kitchen records," he said. "These are the kitchen records," Rose said. "I can only speak to what flows through my kitchen. But if this pattern exists in the supply accounts for food, I'd want to know whether it exists in the accounts for other materials as well." The room was very quiet, and then Walter Grayson spoke. "With respect," he said, and his voice was precisely calibrated, smooth, certain. carrying in it just enough edge of offense to suggest that his character was being impugned by implication. This woman has been on this property for less than 24 hours. She's looking at purchase orders she doesn't have full context for. The discrepancies she's seeing have explanations. There were supplier issues. Delivery problems. I have the correspondence to prove it. Nathaniel looked up from the papers. He looked at Walter. He looked at Rose. Rose said nothing. She kept her hands flat on the desk and her face neutral because she was not here to argue. She was here to show numbers. The numbers could speak without her raising her voice. "Let me see the correspondence," Nathaniel said. Walter hesitated. It was a small hesitation, a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but in the very quiet room it was loud as a shout. "I'd have to locate it," Walter said. "It may take some time." "Then locate it," Nathaniel said. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in its quality had shifted, and Rose recognized what it was. It was the voice of a man who has been handed a doubt and is now sitting with it and examining it, and the examination is not going in the direction the doubted person would prefer. Walter stood up. "I'll have it for you by tomorrow morning," he said. "Tonight," Nathaniel said. "Have it for me tonight." A pause. "Of course," Walter said. He walked to the door. Before he went through it, he turned, and his eyes found Rose with a precision that told her this was not a casual look. It was the look of a man who was deciding what she was to him, whether she was a problem to be managed or a problem to be removed, and he was making that calculation with an efficiency that told her he had made this kind of calculation before. Rose met his eyes without blinking. Walter Grayson walked out. The door closed behind him. Nathaniel sat back in his chair and said nothing for a moment, looking at the papers spread on his desk. "How long," he said at last, "would you say this has been going on?" "Based on what I can see in the kitchen records," Rose said, "at least 3 months. Possibly longer. I can only see as far back as the orders that were stored in the kitchen. If you have older records somewhere else on the property, there may be more." Nathaniel pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. He had the look of a man who is absorbing something unpleasant and making himself sit still while he does it, rather than reacting before he's ready. "Walt's been with this ranch for 2 years, he said. "I know," Rose said. "I'm sorry." "And you found this," he said, "in one day." "I found it in one afternoon," she said, without any particular emphasis, just accuracy. "I was looking at the kitchen inventory, and the numbers didn't match. That's all." Nathaniel looked at her. It was a different kind of looking than he'd done on the porch the day before. That look had been dismissive, the automatic assessment of a man who thinks he already knows what he's seeing. This look was something else. It was the look of recalibration of a man updating a belief he'd held without examining it and finding the update uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Rose," she said, "please." He nodded. Rose. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you thinking right now?" "About Walter." "About all of this." Rose considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything honestly. "I'm thinking," she said, "that a man who's been moving money off this ranch for 3 months has more invested in staying than we understand yet. And I'm thinking that the correspondence he's going to bring you tonight is either going to be real, which would mean I've made a very embarrassing mistake, or it's going to be something he puts together between now and then." Nathaniel let out a slow breath. "And which do you think it is?" he said. "I think," Rose said carefully, "that when a man who has been very still and very controlled hears information he wasn't expecting, and the first crack that appears in his composure is about a piece of documentation, it usually means the documentation is the problem." Caleb, who had been standing quietly by the window this entire time, said, "She's right." Nathaniel looked at him. "You think Walter's been stealing from us?" Caleb said. His voice was flat, but there was something underneath the flatness that Rose understood was a combination of anger and grief, because a man who steals from a ranch steals from every person on it. From every hour of work those 27 men put into that land. "I think," Nathaniel said slowly, "that I need to see that correspondence tonight." He looked at the papers on his desk one more time. Then he picked one up, and he began to read it more carefully than he had the first time. Rose stepped back from the desk. She looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at her. Between them, in the silence of the office, was the shared understanding that something had just shifted in the world of Broken Creek Ranch. Something that had been moving in the wrong direction for a long time had been caught. And the catching of it was only the beginning, and the beginning was already difficult. Outside the office window, she heard the sound of boots on the porch, and she knew without looking that the men were coming in from the range. That they were tired and hungry and headed toward the dining hall, where she would need to be in the next 30 minutes if dinner was going to be ready on time. She excused herself quietly. She walked back to her kitchen. She stoked the fire, checked the pot she'd left simmering, and began cutting the bread she'd set to rise that morning. And her hands were steady and her mind was still moving, still turning the numbers. Still sitting with what she'd seen in Walter Grayson's eyes in the moment he'd recognized those papers. She had been fighting to be seen her entire life. She had been fighting for space at every table she'd ever stood beside. And she had learned through all of it that the most dangerous thing she could ever become was someone that the wrong kind of man decided to take seriously. Walter Grayson had looked at her tonight. He had decided she was serious. That meant whatever came next was going to require more than clean pots and good cornbread. She reached into her apron pocket. She touched the leather cover of her inventory notebook. And she started thinking about what else she might have missed. The correspondence Walter Grayson brought to Nathaniel's office that night was perfect. Too perfect. Rose heard about it the next morning from Caleb, who came to the kitchen before the rest of the men were up, sat down at the cook's table with a mug of coffee she poured without being asked, and told her in a voice that was carefully controlled what had happened after she'd left the office. Walter had produced a full folder of letters. Supplier correspondence, dated and signed, explaining the reduced deliveries in terms of drought-affecting cattle supply, a wagon breakdown on the Harlow Creek Road, a dispute between two of the ranchers who fed into the same distribution line. Every discrepancy accounted for, every number explained. The documentation was thorough and detailed and entirely plausible. Nathaniel had read every page, and Rose said, and he wasn't sure, Caleb said. He told Walter he'd need to verify the correspondence with the suppliers directly. Walter said, of course, that was perfectly reasonable, that he welcomed the scrutiny. Rose turned her coffee mug in her hands. Walter said he welcomed the scrutiny, she said. Those were his exact words. A man who has actually been stealing money from a ranch, Rose said, does not welcome scrutiny. He tolerates scrutiny, he endures scrutiny. He performs cooperation. She looked at Caleb. He does not welcome it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Nathaniel thinks I may have overstepped, Rose said. It wasn't a question. Caleb didn't deny it. He didn't say that. He said the documents look legitimate. They look legitimate, Rose agreed. That's different from being legitimate. She stood up, went to the stove, checked the biscuits. How long has Walter been handling supplier relationships? 2 years, she repeated. So he knows the suppliers. They know him. If a letter arrives asking to verify correspondence, who does that letter go to? Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. The supplier's point of contact, he said slowly. Which would be whoever Walter's been dealing with. And if Walter's been dealing with the same contact for 2 years, Rose said that contact knows Walter. Knows what Walter would want confirmed. She turned from the stove to face him. I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm saying it's a possibility that needs to be considered before Nathaniel sends a letter of verification to a contact Walter chose and cultivated. Caleb put both hands flat on the table. How do you know how to think about this, he said. It came out honest, slightly raw. The question of a man who is genuinely trying to understand something and has run out of ways to pretend he's not confused. I've been underestimated my entire life, Rose said. By people who thought that, because I look the way I look, I must not be paying attention. I've had to pay double the attention just to stay even. After a while, she said, paying attention becomes second nature. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. I'll talk to Nathaniel, he said. Talk to him soon, Rose said. Walter knows I'm watching now. He'll move faster than he would have otherwise. She went back to her biscuits. And in the back of her mind, the numbers kept turning. What happened at the breakfast table that morning was small, and Rose almost missed it. She was carrying the second basket of biscuits from the kitchen to the dining hall when she passed the far end of the serving corridor, and through the gap in the door she saw Walter Grayson at the end of the long table. Talking to a cowboy she knew by sight, but not yet by name, a quiet man in his 30s who kept to himself and had, she'd noticed, a habit of watching her with a particular vigilance of someone keeping track of something. She did not slow her step. She did not turn her head more than the fraction necessary to see what she needed to see. But she watched. Walter was talking low and fast, his thin hands moving in a way that was deliberate but contained, the gestures of a man making a case to someone he needed on his side. The cowboy was listening with his head slightly down and his arms crossed, a posture that could have read as receptive or resistant, depending on how you knew him. Rose kept walking. She set the biscuits on the table. She went back to the kitchen. She took out her notebook and wrote WG, breakfast, far table. The quiet man, fine name. She put the notebook away. She put eggs on to scramble and kept her face exactly as it had been, before she'd looked through the gap. Because a woman who has been underestimated all her life learns very quickly that her greatest advantage is other people's assumption that she isn't looking. She was always looking. His name, she found out from Dusty, was Reuben Cole. She found it out casually, which was the only way to find out anything useful in a place where people were paying attention to what you were asking. She asked Dusty, over the lunch preparation, who was the quiet fellow at the end of the table, the one who never asked for seconds, and Dusty said, "Oh, that's Reuben. He's been here about 8 months. Keeps to himself mostly. Decent enough hand, but not what you'd call sociable." "Is he close with anyone on the ranch?" Rose asked. "Not really," Dusty said. "He takes his meals and he does his work and he goes to bed. Some men are like that. Is he close with Mr. Grayson?" Dusty looked up from the potato he'd been handed to peel, because Rose had learned that the fastest way to get information from a willing informant was to give him a task for his hands while his mouth worked. "Walter? Huh." Dusty thought about it with the concentrated effort of a young man who takes most questions seriously. "I don't know that I'd say close. I've seen them talk." Walter talked to pretty much everybody at one point or another. That's just how he is. He was real friendly. Social, he paused. "Is something wrong with Reuben?" "Not that I know of," Rose said honestly. "I just like knowing who's who." Dusty went back to the potato. "You like knowing an awful lot of things," he said, not with suspicion, but with the sort of observation that young people make when they are noticing something about an adult that surprises them. "Yes," Rose said. She put the information in her pocket alongside Dusty's name, which she'd made sure to learn on her very first morning. And she thought about Walter Grayson talking to Reuben Cole at the far end of the breakfast table, with his thin hands moving. The first direct assault came at 2 o'clock that afternoon. She was alone in the kitchen. The men were out. Caleb was with Nathaniel, and the ranch house had the particular quiet of midday when the work is happening far from the building. Rose was at the kitchen table with her notebook open, working through a set of calculations she'd been building since that morning, when she heard the door open behind her. She turned. Walter Grayson was standing in the kitchen doorway. He was, as always, neat, contained. The kind of man who managed his own presentation the way he apparently managed account books, every detail in its place, nothing revealing itself by accident. Except that this afternoon he had come to her kitchen, which was her territory, and that told her something about where his patience was. "Mr. Grayson," she said. She did not close the notebook. She did not move her papers. She sat exactly as she had been sitting. "Miss Whitaker," he said. He stepped into the kitchen. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," she said pleasantly. "But go ahead." Something shifted in his expression, a recalibration. because he'd come in expecting either more deference or more defensiveness, and she was giving him neither. He recovered quickly. He was good at recovering quickly. "I wanted to have a conversation with you," he said. Directly, rather than through intermediaries. "All right," she said. He came farther into the kitchen and stopped on the other side of the table, which put her papers between them, which was not accidental on her part. She had not moved them. "You've been looking at supply records," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you've shared what you found with Caleb and with Nathaniel." "Yes. I understand why you did that," he said, and he leaned into a tone of patient reasonableness that was, she recognized, very well practiced. "You're new here. You're trying to prove your value. You found something that looked like a discrepancy, and you acted on it. I don't hold that against you." Rose looked at him. "I appreciate that," she said. "What I want you to understand," Walter said, "is that the ranch's supply accounts are more complicated than a kitchen inventory. There are factors at play that aren't visible in the records you were looking at. Supplier relationships, credit arrangements, timing issues between delivery and billing that can make the numbers look out of alignment when they aren't." "I'm sure that's true," Rose said. Walter paused. He'd expected more resistance. She was agreeing with him, and it was throwing off his rhythm. "The correspondence I provided to Nathaniel last night explains the discrepancies," Rose finished. "Yes. I heard. So you understand that there was an innocent explanation." "I understand that there is an explanation," she said. "I'm sure Nathaniel will verify it with the suppliers and we'll all have clarity." The pause this time was longer, of course, Walter said. But the smoothness in his voice had thinned very slightly, like ice thinning in early spring, still intact on the surface, but changed underneath. "Was there something else?" Rose asked. "I wanted to ask you," Walter said, "to come to me directly if you find anything in the kitchen records that concerns you in the future, before taking it to Nathaniel or Caleb, as a professional courtesy." Rose looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. "Because I manage this ranch's accounts," he said, "and I'm the most qualified person to explain what you're seeing." "You're the person the explanation concerns," Rose said. "That's a little different from being the most qualified person to provide it." Walter Grayson went very still, and there it was, the stillness she'd seen crack in Nathaniel's office yesterday, the controlled watchfulness slipping just enough to show what it was covering. The stillness of a man who had been managing this situation with great care for a long time and had just countered something his management tools weren't calibrated to handle. He'd expected her to be intimidated, or to be flattered by the attention, or to be confused by the technical language of accounts and credit arrangements. He had not expected her to see straight through the frame of his request to what the request actually was. "I think," Walter said, and his voice was controlled, still smooth, but there was something underneath it now that Rose could hear the way you hear weather coming, "that you are making a mistake." "I make mistakes sometimes," Rose said. "When I do, I own them and correct them." She folded her hands on the table. "Is that all a beat? You've been here 2 days," Walter said. "Yes," she said. "You don't know this ranch. You don't know the men, the systems, the relationships." "I know my kitchen," Rose said, "and the money that flows through my kitchen. And I know that a woman in my position, in a place she's just arrived, cannot afford to look the other way when something doesn't add up. Not if she wants to be able to live with herself." She met his eyes. "I think you understand exactly what I mean by that." Walter Grayson looked at her for one long, still, cold moment. Then he said, "Good afternoon, Miss Whitaker," and he left. Rose sat at the table and did not move until she heard his footsteps cross the hall and go up the stairs. Then she picked up her pencil. Her hand was perfectly steady. She wrote in her notebook, "He came to me directly. He asked me to route information through him. He is not trying to explain anymore. He is trying to manage." She underlined the last word. Then she turned to a new page and wrote, in careful letters, the name Reuben Cole, and below it she wrote what she had seen at breakfast. And below that she wrote the question that had been forming since the moment she saw Walter's hands moving at that breakfast table. What does Reuben Cole know? She found out that evening in a way she hadn't expected. The men had come in from the range, and dinner was almost ready, and the dining hall had the normal pre-meal noise of boots and voices when Dusty appeared at the kitchen door. And his face had lost its usual ease, and was doing something tighter and younger and less certain. "Rose," he said low. "Something's happening." She wiped her hands on her apron. "What kind of something?" "Reuben's out behind the barn," Dusty said. "He's talking to someone from off the property. A man came on horseback about 20 minutes ago. No one from around here. They're having a serious-looking conversation." Rose looked at the stove dinner would hold for a few minutes, and then she looked at Dusty. "Is Caleb anywhere near the barn?" "He's at the fence line. Far end of the south pasture." She thought for 2 seconds. "Go find him," she said. "Don't run. Walk normal. Tell him quietly what you told me. Tell him to come to the barn but not to announce himself." Dusty stared at her. "You think something's wrong?" "I think," Rose said, "that a man who doesn't socialize and who was in a private conversation with Walter Grayson at breakfast, talking to an unknown visitor from off the property at dinner time, is a coincidence I'm not comfortable with." Dusty's eyes went wide. He went. Rose took off her apron. She hung it on the hook by the door. She thought about tipping off and decided against it, because a heavy woman crossing a ranch yard draws notice in a way a young slim cowboy does not. And the last thing she needed was for Reuben Cole to see her coming and change whatever was being said behind that barn. She went back to the stove. She checked the food. She stood at the stove and she waited, and every minute of waiting felt longer than the one before it, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. Not from fear exactly, but from the heightened alertness of someone who has set something in motion and is waiting to see where it lands. Caleb came through the kitchen door 14 minutes later. His face told her before his words did. "The man on the horse," he said, keeping his voice low even though the kitchen was empty, "is from the Donner Supply Company out of Billings. Name of Barrett. I know him by sight. He comes through this county 4 or 5 times a year." "Walter's supplier contact," Rose said. "Walter's supplier contact," Caleb confirmed. He was telling Reuben that someone from Broken Creek had sent a rider to Billings with a message. The message said that the ranch was going to be sending a letter requesting verification of recent delivery records, and that Mr. Barrett should expect it and should confirm the records as submitted. The kitchen was very quiet. "Walter sent word to Billings," Rose said. "Before we could send a verification letter," Caleb said. "He moved fast. He moved last night," Rosa said. "Or early this morning. He was ahead of us before I even knew there was a race." She looked at Caleb. "The correspondence he brought to Nathaniel last night, it's not just convincing. It's already been coordinated. The supplier contact will confirm it." Caleb put one hand on the back of a chair. He gripped it. "If Barrett confirms the documents," he said, "Nathaniel's going to look at your numbers, and at Walter's documents, and at a verified supplier statement, and he's going to conclude that you made an honest mistake." "Yes," Rose said, "and Walter walks free. Unless," Rose said, "we don't send the letter." Caleb looked at her. "If we don't verify through Barrett," Rose said slowly, thinking it out as she spoke, "we need another way to show that the money left this ranch and didn't come back as food. Walter can coordinate one contact. He can't coordinate every record this ranch has produced in the last 2 years." She looked at Caleb. "What does this ranch keep? What records, not the supply accounts, something different? Payroll, cattle numbers, feed logs? We keep a cattle record," Caleb said. "Every head bought and sold, feed consumption by season. I run that book myself." Rose straightened. If the food supplies were being under-delivered, she said, the cattle would show it. "You can't fake what a cow eats. You can't produce a letter from Billings that explains why your cattle's condition dropped over the same 3 months that the food orders were supposedly disrupted by supply issues." Caleb stared at her. The silence in the kitchen stretched. "The South heard," Caleb said, and his voice had gone quiet in a particular way. In February and March, I logged it as a rough winter. But it wasn't a rougher winter than usual. No, Rose said. It probably wasn't. Caleb stood up. He moved toward the door. Caleb, Rose said. He stopped. Get the cattle record, she said. Bring it to me. Don't tell Walter you're getting it. Don't tell anyone you're getting it. And then, Rose said, we go back to Nathaniel. And this time we go with something Walter Grayson cannot write a letter to explain. Caleb looked at her for one long moment in the lamp-lit kitchen. With the sounds of the dinner hour, beginning in the dining hall on the other side of the wall, boots and voices and ordinary noise of 27 men who were working hard and eating well and had no idea that the ground beneath their ranch was not as solid as they thought it was. I misjudged you, Caleb said. It came out of him quietly, the way true things sometimes come out without announcement, without drama, just there suddenly in the air where it needed to be. Rose looked at him. I know, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked out. Rose turned back to her stove and stared at the pot simmering on the iron range and thought about Walter Grayson, who had looked at her across this kitchen and told her she was making a mistake, and who had already been 2 steps ahead before that conversation even started. She thought about everything she had found in 2 days. She thought about what she hadn't found yet. And she understood, with the particular clarity that came to her sometimes in kitchens, places where she had always thought most clearly, that what Walter Grayson had built was not just a system of theft. It was a system of insurance. Every move he made had a backup. Every record had a corresponding letter. Every accusation had a prearranged defense. A man who built systems like that was not a man who had been improvising. He had been planning this for a very long time, which meant, Rose thought, that somewhere in 2 years of operation on this ranch, there was a seam. A place where the system didn't quite hold. A record he'd overlooked because he hadn't thought anyone would be looking at it, or a number he'd misjudged because the person who would eventually see it wasn't the kind of person he'd planned around. She lifted the pot lid, checked the temperature, put it back. She thought about cattle records and feed logs and the South herd in February. She thought about the seam. She was going to find it. The question was whether she would find it before Walter Grayson decided that managing Rose Whitaker had become less useful to him than removing her entirely. She reached into her apron, the apron hanging on the hook by the door, and pulled out her notebook. She found the page with Reuben Cole's name on it. She turned to the line where she'd written, "What does Reuben Cole know?" And below it, in careful letters, she added, "Reuben Cole is not an ally. He is a warning." She closed the notebook. She went to finish making dinner for 27 men who trusted her to feed them, because that was still her job, and that job still mattered, and she was still the best person in this building at doing it. She was also now, she understood, in more danger than she had been yesterday. And she intended to be ready. Caleb brought the cattle record to her at 10 o'clock that night. He set it on the kitchen table without a word, a thick ledger bound in dark leather, with 2 years of entries in his tight, careful handwriting. Rose had stayed up waiting, the lamp burning low, her notebook open beside a fresh cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She opened the ledger. She read. Caleb sat across from her and watched her face the way a man watches a doctor reading test results, looking for the thing in her expression that would tell him what the numbers meant before she said a word. Rose read for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up. "February," she said. "You logged a 12% drop in average body weight across the South herd." "I attributed it to the cold snap," Caleb said. "What was the temperature that February compared to the February before?" Caleb thought, about the same. Maybe slightly milder, if anything. "So the cold snap explanation doesn't hold." "Not if you look at it that way," he said. "At the time I wasn't looking at it alongside the supply records." "The South herd's feed allocation," Rose said, running her finger down the page. "You logged it as normal. Full allocation, standard winter supplement." "Because that's what Walter submitted as delivered." "But the cattle lost weight on a normal allocation during a milder winter than the year before." Rose looked at him. Either the cattle were sick, the ranch vet came through in March. He found nothing, or they didn't receive the feed that was logged as delivered to them. Rose closed the ledger and placed her hand flat on the cover. Caleb, the feed orders and the food supply orders go through the same account. Through Walter. Caleb's jaw tightened. He's been skimming the feed as well, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. He said it the way a man says something he's been half knowing for several minutes and is finally letting himself say out loud. The cattle can't write letters to Billings, Rose said. Their weight records in February are real. They happened. And they don't match the feed delivery logs Walter submitted. She tapped the ledger. This is your seam. This is the place he didn't cover. Caleb stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped back against the floor. He walked to the kitchen window and stood there, with his back to her. And she could see in the set of his shoulders what this was costing him, not just the anger, but the particular grief of a man who has been proud of running a tight operation, and has just discovered that the operation was being robbed under his watch for 2 years. I should have seen it, he said. You weren't looking for it, Rose said. He was counting on that. That doesn't make me feel better. It's not meant to, she said. It's meant to be accurate. She stood up from the table. Caleb, we need to take this to Nathaniel tonight. He turned from the window. It's after 10, he said. I know what time it is, she said, and the echo of what she'd said to Nathaniel 2 nights ago was deliberate, and from the flicker in Caleb's expression he recognized it. Walter knows I'm looking. He's already sent word to Billings. Every hour we wait is an hour he has to move something else, cover something else, arrange something else. She picked up the ledger. We go tonight. Caleb looked at her for a moment, at this woman who had arrived 3 days ago with 2 worn bags and a proposition, who had in those 3 days upended everything he thought he understood about his own ranch, and he nodded. Tonight, he said. Nathaniel answered his door in his work clothes, which meant he hadn't been to bed, which Rose took as a sign that the situation had been sitting on him the same way it had been sitting on her. He looked at the two of them, at Caleb's face, and at the ledger in Rose's hands, and he stepped back from the door without being asked. They sat in his office for the second time, the lamp turned up high, the ledger open between them on the desk. Rose walked Nathaniel through it the same way she'd walked Caleb through it precisely, without editorializing, letting the numbers speak as much as possible. She showed him the feed allocation logs. She showed him the weight records from February. She showed him the gap between what was delivered on paper and what the cattle's bodies told a different story about. Nathaniel didn't speak while she presented it. He sat very still, and he read every page she pointed to, and the stillness in him was different from Walter's stillness. Where Walter's had been calculated and managed, Nathaniel's was the stillness of a man absorbing something that hurt. When she finished, he sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said 2 years, at minimum, Rose said. He's been here 2 years, Nathaniel said. I brought him on because the man I had before retired. Walter came recommended. I checked his references. His references were probably real, Rose said. He's careful. He doesn't make obvious mistakes. He overlooked the cattle, Nathaniel said. He overlooked the cattle because he didn't think anyone would look at the cattle records, alongside the feed delivery logs, alongside the payment accounts, all at the same time, Rose said. That's 4 separate record systems. He was counting on each one being looked at in isolation. That's how these things work. The seam is always in the place where 2 systems meet, because that's the place the person maintaining both systems assumes nobody's going to cross-reference. Nathaniel looked at her. And you cross-referenced them, he said. I was looking for where the food went, she said. I didn't stop when the first answer didn't hold. Caleb said, Barrett, the supplier contact is already primed to confirm the supply records if we send a verification letter. So we don't send the letter, Nathaniel said. We send a different letter, Rose said. Not to Barrett. To the Billings Supply Company's owner. Not Walter's contact. The man above the contact. Someone Walter doesn't know we know about. Nathaniel frowned. How do you know who the owner is? I don't yet, Rose said. But it'll be on the company's original contract with this ranch, which should be in your files. And if it isn't, the county business registry will have it. She looked at him steadily. The owner of the supply company didn't sign off on this arrangement with Walter. Barrett did. Company owners care about legal liability. If we write to the owner and explain what we've found, he's going to want to protect his company's name. A great deal more than Barrett is going to want to protect his arrangement with Walter. The room was very quiet. Nathaniel looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "She's right." Nathaniel looked back at Rose. "Walter came to me this afternoon," Rose said. "He asked me to route any concerns through him before bringing them to you. He presented it as a professional courtesy." Nathaniel's expression did something complicated. "He came to you directly," he said. "He did, and said what exactly?" She told him. Every word, as close to verbatim as she could recall. Because she had the kind of memory that'd been trained by necessity. When you spent your life in situations where the exact words mattered, you learned to hold them. When she finished, Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He's trying to manage you." "Yes," Rose said. "Which means he's worried about you." "Which means," Rose said, "that the window where we have an advantage is closing." Nathaniel stood up. He walked to the corner of the room where his private filing cabinet stood, a heavy iron-banded thing that he unlocked with a key from his watch chain. He went through it for several minutes, while Rose and Caleb waited. He found the contract. He brought it to the desk and found the ownership line. "Edmund Hale," he said. "Hale Supply and Distribution, Billings." Rose said, "Write to Mr. Hale. Tonight if possible. Send the rider first thing in the morning." "What do I tell him?" Nathaniel said. And the fact that he was asking her, deferring to her on the wording, this man who had laughed at her on his own porch 3 days ago, was something Rose noticed and filed away without comment. "Tell him," she said, "that you have reason to believe one of his company's representatives has been participating in an irregular billing arrangement with a member of your ranch staff. Tell him that you are preparing to make a formal report to the Territorial Marshal's office in 30 days, and that you wanted to give his company the opportunity to cooperate before that report was filed. Tell him that cooperation will be noted and will affect how his company's name appears in the report." Caleb let out a breath that was almost a low whistle. "You're giving Hale a reason to turn on his own man," Caleb said. "I'm giving him an exit," Rose said. "A man with a legitimate business doesn't want his company named in a theft report. If Barrett acted without Hale's knowledge, and there's a reasonable chance he did, because the less Hale knows, the less liability he carries, then Hale's going to be furious. And a furious business owner is a very motivated witness." Nathaniel looked at the contract in his hands. "If I file with the marshal," he said, "this becomes public." "Yes," Rose said. "I know that's difficult. This ranch's credibility—" "Your ranch's credibility," Rose said firmly but not unkindly, "is better served by demonstrating that you found the problem and addressed it, than by allowing it to continue until someone else finds it." She held his gaze. "And someone will find it eventually. These things always come out. The only question is whether they come out on your terms or Walter Grayson's." Nathaniel set the contract on the desk. He sat down. He pulled a sheet of paper toward him and uncapped his pen. "Tell me the wording again," he said. "From the beginning." It was past midnight when Rose finally returned to her kitchen. She didn't sleep. She told herself she'd been up since 4 in the morning. She'd cooked 3 meals and conducted 2 investigations and 2 meetings, and 1 direct confrontation with the man at the center of all of it. And her body had opinions about all of this that it was beginning to state with some persistence. She ignored her body's opinions and sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and went back through every entry she'd made since arriving at Broken Creek Ranch. She was looking for anything she'd missed. She found it on the 3rd pass through. It was a notation she'd made on her very first night, almost as an afterthought in the original inventory of the pantry. She'd noted a discrepancy in the tinned goods specifically, a full case of tinned peaches that appeared on the most recent purchase order but was not physically present on the shelves. She'd written it down and moved past it because peaches were not the emergency. The beef situation was the emergency, and she'd been focused on dinner. She looked at the notation now. 10 peaches, 1 full case. Ordered. Not present. She went to the pantry. She went through the shelves methodically, pulling things out, looking behind, checking the cold cellar entrance, checking the storage alcove behind the root vegetables. No peaches. She went back to the kitchen. She sat down and wrote, "The missing peaches are not interesting because of the peaches. They are interesting because they disappeared after the purchase order was submitted and before the order was logged as received. Someone signed the receiving log for goods that were not there. That signature is on the receiving log." She had seen the receiving log. It was tacked to the board beside the pantry door. She went to the board. She found the log for the most recent delivery. The signature at the bottom was not Walter Grayson's neat, controlled handwriting. It was a different signature, looser, more hurried. The signature of someone who had been asked to sign quickly and had done so without looking carefully at what they were signing. Reuben Cole. Rose stared at the signature. Reuben Cole had signed the receiving log for a delivery that was missing a full case of goods. Which meant that either Reuben Cole was careless, which was possible, or Reuben Cole had signed a log he knew was inaccurate, which was something different entirely. She thought about Walter at the breakfast table, those thin hands moving, making his case in low, urgent words. She thought about Barrett riding in at dinner time, talking to Reuben behind the barn. She thought about a man who built systems with backups, who coordinated contacts in Billings before anyone knew to look. Reuben Cole was not just a man Walter had talked to. Reuben Cole was part of the system. He was the inside signature. The man inside the kitchen operations who could provide legitimacy to receiving logs, who could confirm deliveries that weren't fully there, who could be produced if anyone questioned the receiving process, who could say, "Yes, I was there, I checked the goods, everything was in order." Rose closed her notebook. She understood something then that made her stomach go tight and cold. Walter didn't just have a contact in Billings. Walter had a contact inside the ranch. A man who had been there for 8 months, who kept to himself, who watched Rose with that particular vigilance she'd noticed on her first morning, who had been in a private conversation with Walter at breakfast and with Barrett from Billings at dinner, and who had, 3 days before Rose arrived at Broken Creek Ranch, signed a receiving log for goods that weren't there. 3 days before she arrived, she sat with that for a moment. Then she thought, Walter Grayson knew she was coming. She hadn't announced herself. She'd arrived on impulse, chasing a notice she'd heard about through 3 towns. There was no way Walter could have known specifically that Rose Whitaker was coming. But Walter Grayson was a careful man, a man who built systems with backups and planned for contingencies. A man like that didn't wait for a problem to arrive. He anticipated problems. 3 days before Rose arrived, Reuben Cole had signed a receiving log for goods that weren't there. 3 days before Rose arrived, as if someone had been in a hurry to backfill documentation. As if someone had gotten word that a new cook was coming and had rushed to get signatures in place before she arrived and started asking questions. How would Walter know a new cook was coming? Rose thought about it. She thought about it hard, turning it from every angle, the way she turned a problem in her kitchen, looking for the heat source, looking for where the pressure was building. Nathaniel had told her that 3 cooks had left in 4 months. Which meant Nathaniel had been actively seeking a replacement. Which meant he'd been sending out notices and word of mouth through the county and beyond. Which meant the information that Broken Creek Ranch needed a cook was not a secret. Anyone in 3 counties could have known, including anyone Walter Grayson talked to when he was in town, including any contact he had in Harlow Creek or Millsfield or Copper Bend. The same towns where people had talked to Rose about the ranch's kitchen problem. The same towns where the information about Broken Creek's troubles had found its way to her ears. Had she been expected? Not her specifically. But a cook, a new set of eyes in the kitchen. Walter had moved 3 days before she arrived because he'd heard a new cook was coming and had rushed to shore up his documentation. Which meant the receiving log with Reuben Cole's signature on it was not a coincidence. It was preparation, and it was preparation that had been done carelessly, in a hurry, which meant it was the most vulnerable piece of the whole structure. Rose stood up. She went to the receiving log and carefully, very carefully, unpinned it from the board. She folded it and put it inside her notebook. Then she put her notebook in the bottom of her traveling bag, under the spare dress and the oilcloth pouch with her mother's cooking notes. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch breathe around her. She thought, tomorrow this ends one way or another. She thought, I have the cattle ledger. I have the purchase orders. I have the receiving log. I have Nathaniel writing to Edmund Hale tonight. She thought, Walter Grayson is going to move tomorrow. I don't know how, but he will move. Because he's out of options for managing me, and a man like that, when management fails, does something else. She needed to be up before he was. She closed her eyes. She was at the stove at 4 a.m. when she heard the sound. It was not a normal ranch sound. It was not boots on the porch or cattle shifting or the far sound of the night watch calling to each other across the property. It was a sound that did not belong a particular soft scrape, the kind a drawer makes when it's being opened with great care by someone who does not want to be heard. It was coming from the hall. Rose did not move from the stove. She kept her back to the door and her hands on the pot, and her attention completely, totally, absolutely on the sound. The scrape again, followed by a rustling, not the hall. The office, Nathaniel's office, which was where the contract with Edmund Hale's name on it, was sitting on the desk, along with the letter Nathaniel had drafted last night and left sealed for the morning rider. Rose set down the pot. She moved to the kitchen doorway and looked into the hall. A line of light at the bottom of the office door, thin. Lantern thin, close to the floor, someone moving with a light held low. She stood in the kitchen doorway for 3 seconds, making a decision. Then she went back to the kitchen, picked up the cast iron skillet from the stovetop. It was heavy, and it was real, and it was the most reliable thing in the room, and she walked down the hall to the office door and opened it. Walter Grayson was standing at Nathaniel's desk. He had the letter in his hands. The sealed letter to Edmund Hale. He looked up at her. For one fraction of a second, neither of them moved. Then Walter said, in a voice that was remarkably controlled given the circumstances, "This is not what it appears. You are standing in the ranch owner's private office at 4 a.m, holding his sealed correspondence," Rose said. "What does it appear to be?" Walter set the letter down. Not dropping it, setting it carefully, with control, because even now the control was the thing he reached for. "I came in early to check some accounts. The accounts are not in that drawer," Rose said. "The accounts are in the filing cabinet, which is locked. Which you don't have a key to." She looked at the letter on the desk. "That letter is to Edmund Hale." Walter's eyes went to the skillet in her hand. "I'm not going to hit you," Rose said. "I want to be clear about that. But I'm not going to put it down either, because I don't entirely trust what comes next, and I think you should know exactly what you're dealing with before you decide on your next move." A moment of absolute silence. Walter looked at her at the plain, heavy, steady woman standing in the doorway at 4 a.m. with a cast iron skillet in her hand, and no fear in her face that he could find, and something happened in his expression that she had not seen there before. He was recalculating, not managing, not controlling. Recalculating, from the ground up, the way a man recalculates when he realizes that the ground he built on was not what he thought it was. "What do you want?" he said, and there was something different in his voice. The smooth performance quality had gone out of it. What was left was just a man's voice, tired and stripped down. "I want you to sit down," Rose said, "and I want you to stay in that chair while I go wake Nathaniel Carter and Caleb Morgan. And then I want you to tell the truth, all of it, every piece. Because the evidence we have already," she held his gaze, "is enough to send a letter to the territorial marshal and have it taken seriously. But a man who cooperates and names every person in the arrangement gets treated differently than a man who is caught and silent. Walter stared at her. "You're offering me terms," he said. "I'm telling you your options," she said. "What you do with them is your decision." He stood very still. Then he sat down in the chair on the far side of Nathaniel's desk. Rose went to the bottom of the stairs and called Nathaniel's name. She called it once, clearly, and then she went back to the office doorway and stood where she could see Walter, and she waited. Nathaniel came down the stairs in 4 minutes, Caleb 30 seconds behind him, both of them reading the situation the moment they came through the office door. Nathaniel saw Walter in the chair. He saw the letter on the desk. He saw Rose in the doorway with the skillet. He looked at all three of these things with a focused, taking stock expression, and then he looked at Rose. "He was here when you came in?" Nathaniel said. "I heard him from the kitchen," she said. About 10 minutes ago, Nathaniel walked to his desk. He picked up the letter, checked the seal, confirmed it was intact. He set it back down. He pulled his own chair out from behind the desk and sat in it, across from Walter, and the two men looked at each other in the lamplight. "Walter," Nathaniel said. Walter said. His voice was very flat now, the performance entirely gone. "I think," Nathaniel said, "that you're going to tell me everything." Walter looked at the desk between them. He looked at the cattle ledger, which Rose had placed on the corner of the desk. When she came in, she'd brought it from the kitchen, because she'd had it in her hands when she heard the noise, because she had spent the last hour at the stove going through it one more time. He looked at the stack of purchase orders. He looked at the letter to Edmund Hale. And then Walter Grayson, who had spent 2 years being the most careful man on Broken Creek Ranch, let out a long, slow breath. "Barrett approached me," he said, 14 months ago. "Not 2 years. 14 months. The first 6 months I was here, everything was clean." He stopped. "I want that on record. The first 6 months were clean." "Noted," Nathaniel said. "Go on." "Barrett said he had an arrangement with 3 other ranches. A small percentage of each order redirected. The delivery logs adjusted. The payments processed normally." Walter looked at the desk. He said nobody had noticed in 2 years of running it across the other 3 properties. He said it was low enough to be invisible. "And you agreed," Caleb said from the doorway, his voice flat and iron hard. "I agreed," Walter said. "Just the statement." "Reuben Cole," Rose said. Walter looked at her. "Barrett brought him," Walter said. "He was already on Barrett's payroll. He moved him into the ranch 8 months ago as a regular hire. I didn't recruit him. I didn't want to know the details of how Barrett managed his end." He paused. "I understand now. That's not a distinction that helps me." "No," Nathaniel said quietly. "It doesn't." "The peach delivery," Rose said. 3 days before I arrived." Walter looked at her again. Something like genuine surprise moved through his face. "You found that." "I found that," she said. "Who told you a new cook was coming?" "Barrett," Walter said. "He heard it in town. He told me to make sure the receiving documentation was in order before anyone new started looking at the kitchen." He looked at the ledger. "I didn't know it would be you." "What did you expect?" Rose said. "I expected," Walter said, with something in his voice that was almost wry and almost sad and entirely exhausted, "someone who would cook and not look too carefully at anything else." He paused. "I underestimated you." The room was quiet. "How much, Walter?" "Total," Walter told him. The number landed in the room like a stone landing in still water, the silence around it spreading and spreading. It was more than Rose had calculated, significantly more. Because it wasn't just food and feed, it was materials, lumber, fencing wire, veterinary supplies, ranch equipment, 14 months of skimming across every supply category the ranch ran. Nathaniel sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. "My God," he said quietly. Caleb in the doorway had gone very still. Rose could see in the set of his shoulders what the number was doing to him, the weight of it landing on a man who felt responsible for the operation of this ranch, who had not seen what was happening 2 feet from where he worked every day. Walter said the money went to Barrett. "Not all of it, I took a percentage." but most of it went to Barrett. He ran the same arrangement at the other 3 ranches. He's been operating it for 2 years across the whole county. Names, Nathaniel said. The other 3 ranches. Walter named them. Nathaniel wrote them down. Barrett's contact above him, Rose said. Did he work alone, or is there someone above him at the supply company? Walter looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Edmund Hale doesn't know, Walter said. I'm fairly certain of that. Barrett ran this without Hale's knowledge. Which means stop. Which means when Hale gets our letter, Rose said, he won't have a reason to protect Barrett. No, Walter said, he won't. Nathaniel folded the names list and put it in his breast pocket. He stood up. He looked at Walter for a long moment, at a man he had trusted, who had sat in this office across from him dozens of times over 2 years, who had provided neat, confident accounts and calibrated reassurance, and the particular comfort of someone who always seemed to have everything in order. You'll stay on the property, Nathaniel said. Your movement is restricted to your quarters in the main house. You will cooperate fully with every question asked of you. You will write down everything you told us tonight and sign it. He paused. In the morning, I'll send for the marshal. Walter nodded. He didn't look like a man who was going to argue. He looked like a man who was profoundly tired. Nathaniel walked to the door. He stopped beside Rose. He looked at her, at the skillet still in her hand, at the steadiness in her face, at the 3 days compressed into this moment, and he said very quietly, "Thank you." Rose looked at him. "I was just doing my job," she said. Nathaniel shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You were doing a great deal more than that." He glanced at the desk, at the evidence laid out there, at everything she had found and organized and protected and carried through 3 days that would have broken most people. "I owe you an apology that I'm not sure I know how to make big enough." "You can start," Rose said, "by letting me reorganize the pantry properly. I've been improvising around your storage system for 3 days, and it's been driving me half to madness." Something moved through Nathaniel Carter's face, something that started at the corners of his eyes and worked its way out, something that broke through the weight of the last hour and the exhaustion and the grief of what Walter had told them, something that was the first honest and uncomplicated thing she had seen on his face since she arrived. He laughed. It was a real laugh, short and surprised and genuine. He walked out of the office, still shaking his head. Caleb came to stand beside her in the doorway. He looked at Walter, still sitting in the chair, and then he looked at Rose. "How did you know he'd come for the letter tonight?" Caleb said. "I didn't know," Rose said. "I thought he might. A careful man runs out of options, and he goes back to the most important piece, the piece that puts him most at risk. The letter to Hale was the most dangerous thing in this building to Walter Grayson. I thought if I stayed up, there was a reasonable chance he'd come for it." "You stayed up all night," Caleb said. "I was up anyway," she said. "I had bread to start." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it properly." Rose looked at him. "When you walked through that gate 3 days ago," he said, "I decided who you were before I learned a single thing about you. I looked at you and I made a judgment about what you were capable of and what this ranch needed, and I was wrong in every direction." He stopped. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that cost him. "I have been wrong about a lot of people in my life. But I don't think I have ever been as wrong about a person as I was about you. And I think you should know that I know it." Rose was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she'd carried into this ranch 3 days ago, not just the 2 worn bags, but everything under them. Every kitchen she'd been turned away from. Every town where someone's eyes had moved over her and made a decision. Every door that had required twice the effort to open because of how she looked walking toward it. She thought about all of that. And then she said, "I know you know it, Caleb. And I appreciate that you said it." She walked back toward the kitchen. "The bread needs starting," she said over her shoulder. "And there are 27 men who are going to be hungry in about 2 hours." She heard him stand in the hall for a moment. Then she heard his boots on the floor, steady and deliberate, as he went to do whatever needed to be done next. And Rose Whitaker went back to her kitchen, and she built the fire up, and she started the bread, and her hands were steady and her mind was clear, and outside the window the Montana night was beginning just barely, just at the edges to think about turning into morning. The bread came out of the oven at 6 in the morning, and the smell of it moved through the ranch house the way good news moves through a small town quietly at first, and then all at once, reaching every corner before anyone had decided to carry it there. The men came in to breakfast, not knowing what had happened in the office 4 hours earlier. They came in the way they always came in now, with an ease that hadn't been there before Rose arrived, a looseness in how they moved toward the table, the absence of the braced, armor-up quality that bad food and uncertain circumstances put into a man's body over time. They came in expecting to be fed well, and that expectation alone, the simple animal comfort of knowing the meal would be good, had changed something in how they carried themselves through the door. Dusty came in first, same as always, and stopped when he saw Caleb standing by the kitchen doorway with an expression on his face that didn't match a normal breakfast morning. "Something wrong?" Dusty said. "Eat your breakfast," Caleb said. "There'll be a meeting after." The word meeting moved through the dining hall the way a change in weather moves through felt before it's understood, prompting a subtle shift in attention, men looking up from their plates and then back down, the noise level dropping by a fraction that nobody would have been able to quantify, but everybody registered. Rose served the meal and said nothing. She kept her face the same as it had been every morning, present, focused, unhurried. She filled mugs and set out plates and answered Dusty's whispered "Rose, what's going on?" with a quiet eat first that left him no room to push further. She was aware of Reuben Cole at the far end of the table. He had come in with the others, but he had known the moment he walked through the door that something had shifted. She could see it in how he sat, not the loose, slightly removed posture of a man who kept to himself, but the careful, contained posture of a man who was holding himself very still because moving felt dangerous. He didn't look at her. She noticed that he didn't look at her. When breakfast was finished and the men were pushing back from the table, Nathaniel came into the dining hall. He came in quietly, without announcement, just walked through the door and stood at the head of the room and waited for the talking to settle, which it did quickly. Because Nathaniel Carter was not a man who stood in the middle of a room without a reason, and everyone in it knew that. "I need to tell you all something," he said, "and I need you to hear it from me directly, not secondhand." The room was very still. "Walter Grayson has been removed from his position at this ranch," Nathaniel said. "He'll be in the custody of the territorial marshal by tomorrow. He's been stealing from this operation for over a year's supply orders, feed accounts, materials. A significant amount of money." He paused. "I won't tell you that I'm not angry, because I'll tell you that it's been handled, the evidence is solid, and the marshal will deal with it properly." The silence after that was the kind that has weight to it. Then Tuck said, from his end of the table, in a voice that was very quiet for such a large man, "How'd you find it?" Nathaniel looked down the room. He looked at Rose, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands. "Rose found it," he said, "in the kitchen records the first afternoon she was here. She cross-referenced the purchase orders against the feed logs and the cattle records, and she found the pattern that nobody else had seen." He said it plainly, without any ornamentation, just the clean statement of a fact. "She's the reason this ranch is going to recover instead of continuing to bleed." 26 heads turned toward Rose. She stood in the kitchen doorway and felt 26 different kinds of looking land on her, and she kept her face still, and her breathing even, and her hands quiet on the dish towel. "There's one more thing," Nathaniel said, and something in his voice changed, went quieter, more deliberate. "Reuben Cole has been working with Walter and with the supplier contact. He signed off on receiving logs for goods that weren't fully delivered. The marshal will want to speak with him as well." The room moved then, not loudly, not with chaos, but with that collective reorientation that happens when a group of people who have been living close together discovers that one of them was not what they appeared. Men shifted in their seats. A few of them looked at the far end of the table where Reuben sat. Reuben stood up. He stood up slowly, not frantically, with the deliberate movement of a man who has known for several hours that this moment was coming and has had time to decide how he would meet it. He looked at Nathaniel. "I'll cooperate," he said. His voice was flat and steady. "I want that noted." "I'll cooperate fully." Nathaniel nodded once. "Caleb will stay with you until the marshal arrives." Reuben sat back down. The room exhaled. The morning after the marshal came and went was the first morning at Broken Creek Ranch that felt entirely different from everything before it. Rose felt it when she woke at 4, the same time she always woke, and lay for a moment in the narrow cot in her room off the kitchen, listening to the ranch. It was the same sound, same cattle, same wind, same distant early noise of a working property beginning to move toward its day. But something in the quality of the air felt lighter. The particular weight that she hadn't been fully conscious of until it lifted was gone. She got up, she started the fire, she started the coffee. She stood at the stove in the early dark and thought about the 14 months Walter Grayson had been quietly draining this ranch. She thought about 27 men eating poor food and working harder to compensate for what they didn't know was being stolen from them. She thought about Nathaniel, sitting in his office with records he trusted, and a man he trusted, and no particular reason to look behind either. She thought this is what happens when nobody's looking at the seam. She had spent her entire life being the person nobody expected to look. The person whose size and shape told other people, before she'd opened her mouth or lifted a hand, that she was not the one paying careful attention. She had spent her entire life being underestimated by people who thought they were reading something true about her and were reading something entirely about themselves. And she had learned quietly, over years in kitchens from Ohio to Montana, to make that their problem instead of hers. She poured herself a coffee and sat at the cook's table and opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote at the top what this ranch needs now. She started a list. Not a list of grievances or a list of what had gone wrong. A list of what came next. A proper supply relationship with a new contact above Barrett. She'd already drafted the letter to Edmund Hale's company in her head. A reorganized receiving system that required 2 signatures on every delivery log, not one. A monthly cross-reference between the supply account and the actual physical inventory, done by someone other than the person who managed the supply account. She wrote for an hour. By the time the first gray light showed at the kitchen window, she had 3 pages. Nathaniel found her there when he came downstairs. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the woman at his cook's table, writing in her notebook by lamplight with a cup of coffee at her elbow, and he stood there for a moment without announcing himself. The way a person sometimes stands at the edge of a scene that is showing them something true and doesn't want to interrupt it. Then Rose looked up. "Coffee's on," she said. He came in and poured a mug and sat down across from her at the table, not at the head of it the way he might have sat at his office desk, but across from her, the way 2 people sit when they are going to talk plainly. He looked at the notebook. "May I?" She turned it around and slid it across the table. He read. He read slowly, going through all 3 pages, and his expression moved through several things: recognition, and something that might have been relief, and something else that was harder to name. A kind of reckoning with the distance between where the ranch had been 3 days ago and where it was being pointed now by a woman writing at his kitchen table before sunrise. He put the notebook down. "You've been thinking about this all morning," he said. "I've been thinking about this since the first afternoon," she said. "I just needed the situation to resolve before I could say any of it usefully." Nathaniel wrapped both hands around his mug. "The receiving system," he said, pointing at the second page. 2 signatures. It's the simplest fix, Rose said. It's what would have stopped Reuben Cole from being useful to Walter. 1 person signing for a delivery is a single point of failure. 2 people means you need 2 people willing to participate, which is a much harder arrangement to maintain. "Who would you have do it?" "Dusty," Rose said immediately. "He's honest. He's observant when he's paying attention. And he genuinely cares about this place, probably more than he knows yet. Nathaniel considered that. He's young, he said. He won't always be, Rose said. And the work will help him grow into himself, faster than anything else you could give him. Nathaniel nodded slowly. The supplier relationship, he said, moving to the next item on her list. Edmund Hale will want to repair the connection with this ranch, Rose said. Barrett acted without his knowledge, and it's exposed his company to liability across 4 properties. Hale will be motivated to offer better terms, better contact protocols, direct correspondence to someone on this ranch other than whoever manages the accounts. She looked at Nathaniel. I'd suggest those letters come to you directly, or to Caleb. Not to any single supply manager who might be in a position like Walter's, Nathaniel finished. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to talk to you about something else. Rose waited. When I hired my last 3 cooks, Nathaniel said I was hiring someone to feed 27 men. That's the job I had in my head. Cook for the ranch, keep the men fed, keep the kitchen running. He turned his mug slightly on the table. That's not actually what a cook does. That's not what you do. I cook, he agreed. And you run a small economy. And you manage relationships. And you notice things that other people overlook. And you solve problems that have nothing to do with food, except that they flow through the kitchen, because everything that's a working ranch flows through the kitchen if you know how to look at it. He met her eyes. I didn't know how to look at it. You did. From the first afternoon. Rose looked at him. What are you asking me, Mr. Carter? She said. Nathaniel, he said, please. And the echo of her own words from the first night rose. Please was deliberate, she could tell, and it landed the way he meant it to. What are you asking me, Nathaniel? She said. He straightened. I want to offer you a formal position, he said. Not just cook. Ranch manager. Full authority over the kitchen, the supply accounts, the receiving system, the household operations. Same authority Caleb has over the range operations. Equal footing, equal say, reporting directly to me, he paused. With wages to match. The kitchen was very quiet. Rose looked at the man across the table from her at the ranch owner, who had laughed at her on his porch 4 days ago, who had questioned every instinct she'd demonstrated, who had almost let Walter Grayson's smooth documentation override the evidence she'd put in front of him, who had sat in this kitchen the night. Walter was caught and looked at her with something like awe, and something like shame, and something like the beginning of an understanding that genuine competence had no particular shape. She thought about what it had taken to get to this table. She thought about the hundreds of miles between here and the last place she'd stood and been told, in one form or another, that she was not what was needed. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Ohio and the smell of bread in the early morning, and the thing her mother had always said about food, that it was never really about the food. She said, I want a proper contract, written, signed, witnessed by Caleb. Nathaniel blinked. Then he almost smiled, of course. And I want the kitchen expansion I've been planning in my head since the second morning, she said. The east wall needs a proper second range. The cold cellar access needs to be moved so it doesn't require goinking through the main kitchen to reach it. And the storage room is being used completely wrong. I need the shelving reconfigured before the next supply delivery. Done, he said. And Dusty gets a raise when he takes on the receiving co-signature, she said. He shouldn't be asked to take on more responsibility for the same pay. Nathaniel looked at her. You're negotiating on behalf of one of my hands, he said. I'm telling you what's fair, she said. You can disagree. He didn't disagree. He said, I'll have Caleb draw up the contract today. Good, Rose said. She picked up her notebook, turned it back around, and looked at her list. Now, she said, let me tell you the rest of what's on here, because I haven't gotten through the pantry reorganization yet, and that section is the longest. She told Caleb about the contract herself. She found him at the fence line after lunch, doing the kind of methodical manual work that men do when they're thinking hard and need their hands occupied. He was checking fence posts, moving along the line with a practiced efficiency, and he looked up when he heard her coming across the field. He waited. Nathaniel offered me a management position, she said, when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. Caleb studied her face. What kind of management position? She told him. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, equal footing with me. That's what he said. And you said yes. I said I wanted a written contract, she said. He said yes. Something moved through Caleb's expression, complex and layered, the kind of thing that happens on a person's face when they're sorting through multiple feelings that don't all point in the same direction. She gave him time to sort. He said, Rose, I need to say something to you that I mean entirely. All right, she said. This ranch, he said, has been running at less than it should for a long time. Not just because of Walter, before Walter. There's been a kind of slowness in this place. An acceptance of things being harder than they need to be. Men eating poorly and compensating with more work. Systems that made sense once and nobody questioned after. He turned the fence post tool in his hands. In 4 days you have reorganized the kitchen, exposed a 14-month theft operation, given 27 men back their appetite and their morale, and apparently designed an expansion plan for the east wall. He paused. Equal footing seems like we're getting the better end of that arrangement. Rose looked at him for a long moment. You're good at what you do, Caleb, she said. The range operation, the cattle management, the men, you know all of that better than I ever will. I don't want your territory. I want my no, he said. That's why this works. She nodded. She turned to go back. Rose, he said. She stopped. For what it's worth, he said, I'm glad you pushed that door open. She thought about the door, that ranch house door, both hands. The sound like a judge's gavel, and she felt something move through her that she didn't have an immediate name for, but that was warm and solid, and lived somewhere deep behind the breastbone. So am I, she said. She walked back to her kitchen. 2 weeks passed. The marshal's visit had come and gone efficiently. Walter Grayson and Reuben Cole were in custody in Billings. Barrett, confronted by Edmund Hale's own investigator before the territorial authorities arrived, had provided a full account of the arrangement across all 4 ranches. 3 other ranch owners in the county had received letters from the marshal's office requesting meetings. The supplier company had severed its relationship with Barrett, and Edmund Hale had sent a personal letter to Nathaniel expressing both his apologies and a revised terms offer that was, as Rose had predicted, significantly more favorable than the previous arrangement. She had written the response letter herself. Nathaniel had signed it. The new contract was in place. Caleb had witnessed it, Nathaniel had signed it, and Rose had folded her copy and put it in the bottom of her traveling bag, under the spare dress and the oilcloth pouch with her mother's cooking notes, next to the leather notebook. She kept it there because she wanted to be able to feel the weight of it when she reached for anything else in the bag, the weight of a document that said, in legal language, witnessed and binding, that she was exactly what she had always been, and that this ranch knew it. The kitchen's expansion was underway. 2 men had been assigned to the East Wall project, and Rose had drawn the plans herself on a sheet of paper at the cook's table and walked both men through exactly what she needed and why, and they had listened with the complete attention of people who understood that she knew what she was doing. The cold cellar access was being moved. The shelving had been reconfigured. The receiving system now required 2 signatures, and Dusty had taken on that responsibility with a seriousness that made Rose feel something close to pride. He approached each delivery with the focused attention of someone who understood that his signature meant something and intended to be worthy of it. His wages had been adjusted as agreed. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Rose Whitaker had pushed open the door of Broken Creek Ranch with both hands, the dining hall was full and loud, and the kind of warmth that comes from people who are comfortable with each other and know it. Rose carried out the last pot of the evening, a deep dish apple cobbler, made with dried apples reconstituted slowly and sweetened with the good molasses she'd found in the reorganized cold cellar. And when she set it on the table, the noise in the hall changed in that particular way. She'd come to know the wave of stillness, the heads coming up, the involuntary sound of pleasure at what was coming. Tuck said. From his end of the table, Lord rose. What did we do to deserve this? You showed up and worked, she said. Same as every day, he laughed. It was an unguarded sound, the laugh of a man who is not performing but just responding to something genuinely good, and it moved through the hall and picked up other laughs as it went. Rose went back to the kitchen. She stood at her stove and listened to the dining hall to the particular noise of 27 men who had, over 3 weeks, been gradually unguarded by good food, and the feeling that someone was paying attention to what they needed, and she felt the weight of it settle into her chest the way things settle when they have found the place they were meant to be. She had stood in a lot of kitchens. She had stood in kitchens where the pay was barely sufficient and the conditions were barely tolerable, and the people around her had barely accepted her presence. She had stood in kitchens where she was managed and contained and given just enough room to operate that nobody could say she wasn't being treated fairly, while also making absolutely certain she understood exactly how provisional that space was. She had cooked good food in all of those kitchens. She had paid attention in all of those kitchens. She had kept her notebook and her accounting and her patience in all of those kitchens. And she had left them all, eventually, because the space given to her was never the space she deserved. She was not leaving this kitchen. Nathaniel came in near 8 o'clock, the same time he'd come in on her first night, and she had the same sense of him standing in the doorway before he announced himself. The same quality of a man who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. This time she turned before he spoke. I know you're there, she said. I know you do, he said. He came in and sat at the cook's table, not as the ranch owner surveying his property, but as a man who had gotten into the habit of sitting in this kitchen at the end of the day because it was, he had told her once simply and without elaboration, the best room on the ranch to think in. Rose sat across from him. I had a letter today, Nathaniel said. From Hale? From my sister in Laramie, he said. She's been asking when I'm going to come visit. She asks every spring and every fall. I've been saying I can't leave the ranch. He looked at the table. This is the first time in 2 years I've felt like I actually could. Rose looked at him. The ranch would run while you were gone, she said. I know, he said. And the weight in those 2 words, the particular quality of a man who has just finished understanding something he probably should have understood earlier, was something Rose heard clearly. Go see your sister, she said. I might, he said. He looked up at her. Can I ask you something, he said. You can ask, she said. When you walked through that door, he said, that first morning. When I laughed, he stopped. You had to have been. Yes, Rose said simply. He looked at her. But you stayed, he said. I needed the work, she said. And I had a proposition to make. And she paused, considering how much of this to say, deciding on honesty because she was generally in favor of it. I have been walked away from too many times by men who looked at me and saw everything except what I was actually capable of. I made a decision a long time ago that I was not going to be the one to do the walking. That if a door was going to close on me, someone else was going to have to close it. I was going to keep pushing. She looked at her hands flat on the table. You didn't close it. I almost did, he said. Almost is different from did, Rose said. You stepped back. That mattered. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very carefully, the way a man says something he has been working up to and wants to say correctly, I think this ranch has never had anyone in it who was actually right for it. Not all the way right. Not in the way that means. The way that means this is where a person belongs. He stopped. He tried again. I've had good hands, and I've had good foremen, and I've had decent cooks, and I've run a ranch that worked. But I don't think I've understood before what it looks like when the right person is in the right place. He met her eyes. I understand it now. The kitchen was very quiet. Rose looked at Nathaniel Carter, this man who had laughed at her on his porch and stepped back from his door and sat across from her at this table, at the end of every evening for 3 weeks. This man who was difficult and proud, and had been wrong in almost every early assumption, and had corrected every single one of them when the evidence required it, This man who had signed a contract and meant it, and she felt something she had not let herself feel in a very long time. She felt in this kitchen, in this ranch, in this territory at the far edge of everything familiar, something that had the shape of home. Not the home she'd lost when the boarding house closed and her family scattered to the wind of grief and circumstance. Not the home of Ohio and her mother's kitchen and the smell of bread in the mornings of her childhood. Not a home that belonged to the past. A home that was happening right now at this table, in the ongoing present tense of a life that had kept going even when she wasn't sure it should. "I think," Rose said, "that you should go to Laramie and see your sister." Nathaniel almost smiled. "You said that already." "I meant it both times," she said. "This kitchen will be standing when you get back. Your men will be fed. The accounts will be in order." She picked up her coffee mug. "Go be a person for a week. The ranch will wait." He looked at her. He said, "You sound very sure of yourself." "I am," she said. "I have been for a long time. It just took me a while to find somewhere the sureness was welcome." He nodded slowly. He stood up. He looked around the kitchen at the clean, reorganized, properly running kitchen that smelled of apple cobbler and good coffee and the particular warmth of a fire that had been built right and was burning clean, and he said, "Good night, Rose." "Good night, Nathaniel," she said. He walked out. She sat in the kitchen for a few minutes more, the lamp burning steady, her notebook to table, the sounds of the ranch settling into the particular quiet of a place that is at rest. She thought about 27 men at a table who had learned to trust their food, and through it had learned to trust their place on this ranch, and through that had become more fully what working men at their best can be, capable and present and grounded in the daily proof that someone gave enough thought to take care of them. She thought about a cattle ledger and a receiving log and a skillet at 4 in the morning and a door pushed open with both hands. She thought about her mother, who had fed boarding house strangers twice a week for 20 years, and who had understood, better than anyone Rose had ever met, that feeding people was never about the food. It was about the decision to believe that the persons across the table from you deserved to be taken care of. It was about making that decision every single day, even on the days when you were tired, even on the days when the pantry was thin, even on the days when nobody thanked you, even on the days when somebody laughed. Rose Whitaker had made that decision every day of her life. She made it in bad kitchens and provisional kitchens and kitchens that were never going to be hers. And she made it here, in this kitchen that was hers now, on a ranch in Montana in 1883, with a contract in her bag and bread rising for tomorrow morning, and 27 men sleeping under the same roof who had learned, in 3 weeks, what it felt like to be genuinely fed. She closed her notebook. She turned down the lamp. She went to bed in the room that was hers, and she slept without difficulty, and she did not dream of leaving. The woman who had been told she would never feed those cowboys had fed them and protected them and rebuilt the ground under their feet, and proved something that the world kept trying to forget and that she kept refusing to let it. That a person's worth was not in her size or her shape or the first impression she made in a doorway. It was in what she did when the door opened. Rose had known what to do. She had always known. And now at last she was exactly where that knowing had always been, carrying her, standing in her own kitchen, in her own life, in the full and undiminished truth of who she had always been. That was not a small thing. That was everything.